Thank you again so much for being here. This is a session that I'm really excited to be co-presenting on. And this session is aimed at the crossroads of three different topics. One of them, of course, is peer learning. And we have the crossroads between peer learning, accessibility, and tools. So I'm really happy to be here with Amy Deshane on accessibility and Carrie Foley on peer learning, and I'm here to talk about tools. But in the spirit of peer learning, we've learned a lot from each other, I can say. In prepping for this session, a lot of this is stuff that is new to me as well. And trying to bring these three different topics together has been a real great experience to kind of see how these different topics play with each other. We have a pretty straightforward agenda today. We're going to start with the bigger picture, talking a little bit about accessibility, teaching practices and tools in general, and how we can make our peer learning activities and our classes more accessible, and just learning about those topics in general. And then we're going to dive into some specific examples. We've chosen 2 examples of peer learning activities so that we can pick through them, try to apply some accessibility practices and tools and tips and tricks. And then, time permitting, we'll take some time to do some peer learning in this space as well. To follow one of our tips, we're having a digital copy of the resources at this bit.ly link. It's bit.ly/hilt, that's lowercase hilt, -A11Y-resources. And a little tidbit of trivia here. The A11Y stands for accessibility. There's 11 letters between the A and the Y. It's a really long word. So that's our little abbreviation there. And so at any point, you'll be able to find the slides, the handout, and the activity. We've also written it on the whiteboards if it's not on the slides at the time that you're looking for it. So without further ado, I would like to hand it off to Amy to start us off on that big picture.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Amy Deshane. I want to start us off today with a very straightforward definition of accessibility. So accessibility, making content and experiences available to and usable by everyone, including and especially people with disabilities. Now, you're at this session today. I'm guessing you know what accessibility is, but sometimes when you're working with other people, or especially vendors too, sometimes it's nice to have a definition like this in your pocket. I've worked with vendors before where people will say accessibility and they'll be like, yeah, it works on an iPhone. They just don't get it. So having a nice quick definition can be really useful. So a little bit more about me. I am the head of UX and digital accessibility for Harvard Library, and I also oversee the User Research Center, which is a usability and digital accessibility testing lab. So we're located in Lamont, and we're available for anyone at Harvard to use to do user research. In my day-to-day work, I am doing digital accessibility testing and usability testing on Harvard Library's central digital products like Hollis, library.harvard.edu, our digital collections platform, those kind of things. So I work with both disabled and non-disabled students doing UX testing on those things. A little bit more about the User Research Center. So like I said, we're located in Lamont and available to anyone at Harvard who's doing UX testing. We have services include things like consultations. Actually, right now, Friday mornings from 10 to 12, we have drop-in hours where you can talk with a UX or digital accessibility expert, get some questions answered, get ideas for how to incorporate people with disabilities in your testing for learning objects, course design, anything like that. We also have learning opportunities like brown bags, where we talk about different topics and host guest speakers from across campus who are in this field. And we also have a lab space. So this is a photo from our lab where we have technology that you can use to test for digital accessibility. So we have desktops and lendable laptops that have screen readers, zooming software, things like that. And then you can also book the lab to run testing. We have 2 different participant pools that you can recruit from, one of non-disabled Harvard undergrad and graduate students, and one with disabled people from the local area who use assistive technology and can be included in user testing. So I've been at Harvard for almost 5 years now, and I've definitely heard from students about some of accessibility-related barriers they've experienced. So I wanted to share one of those stories with this group today. So this is Tasha. She's an alum of GSE, and she did some work for us a couple of years ago in the library. And she said, if I could share this story in presentations like this one so people would better understand what her experience was like. And she's blind, and she uses JAWS, which is a screen reader, to access course materials while she was in classes at Harvard. Now, before GSE went on to Canvas, they were on iSites, which Tasha said it worked pretty well. The only area in iSites that was problematic was where the grades and comments on her assignments would be left by her professors. And she said, at the beginning of this semester, she made her professors aware that, this part of the software didn't work for her. And if the grades could be delivered in a different format, that would be really helpful. But she said by the end of the semester, sometimes people would forget, and it was just hard to keep reminding them. So she actually ended up, waiting a really long time to hear what her grades were, getting her comments. She just kind of added to her stress level on top of already being a graduate student at Harvard. So what she shared with me is that she had to ask a friend to check her grade, tell her grade, read her the comments, which she characterized as not an ideal situation, which I think puts it pretty lightly, right? So clearly this put Tasha in an inequitable position. She's having to ask one of her classmates to read her these personal comments directly from the faculty member. So students really expect this level of private communication, and it wasn't available to Tasha when GSE had been using iSites because it wasn't vetted for accessibility. Now GSE is on Canvas. This is not a problem anymore, so we are moving forward. But I think these little sort of examples can really help, put a face on some of the issues that people experience. So I also think it's really helpful. We're going to talk about really great procedures and tips and tools. And there are things out there like checklists and standards, but really to keep, when you're thinking about accessibility, keep things people focused. So to put it in a broader sense, this is a stat from the census, the most recent one. 19% of the US population has a disability. And by all estimations, this is actually probably very low because these are people who have self-identified in this kind of survey as having a disability. So this wouldn't include people who maybe have a short-term disability. For example, my friend who lives in New York, she's an avid theater goer. She just broke her ankle last weekend. And now she's trying to decide, can she actually go to the theater, walk up 2 flights of steps to get to the mezzanine? Even if she were to walk into this room right now, she'd probably really consider where to sit based on the fact that her mobility is impaired because of this injury. So this number, like I said, probably pretty low. It also depends on the person's willingness to disclose they have a disability. Some people don't want to do that, and that's their right. So just keep this stat in mind, but know that it's kind of low. So disabilities fall into 4 broad categories: visual, hearing, cognitive, and mobility. And I want to just take a moment to think about these individually. So for visual disabilities, things like blindness, having low vision, sensitivity to light, and also color blindness would be included here as well. For related to hearing, deafness and being hard of hearing, being deaf in one ear. For cognitive disabilities, things like learning disabilities, the inability to focus, things like dyslexia. Those are all part of a large swath of cognitive disabilities. And then mobility. Oftentimes with mobility, people will use the wheelchair icon, but I like to use the finger pointing icon to sort of remember that it is more broad than just people who are using a wheelchair or a scooter. This could be someone with a hand tremor, someone with inability to use a mouse and they're using a keyboard or an alternative input device, or any limited fine motor control would also be included in this group. So some people with disabilities may be using assistive technology. So a lot of times you might hear the shortcut AT. So AT is just assistive technology. It's additional technology that they're installing, software or peripherals. You might see someone, for instance, who has low vision, who has put stickers on their keyboard to be able to feel where the keys are to get their hands in the right spot. So a couple of different kinds of assistive technology for each of the 4 categories. For people who have visual disabilities, they may be using a screen reader. So this piece of software is going to read them all of the content that's on the screen. And oftentimes there's the ability to jump around to headings on the page or to links on the page. Just like if you, as a sighted user, went to newyorktimes.com, you might want to just zoom in on the headings and read all the headings. On a screen reader, the person can just listen to all the headings. A couple of different kinds of screen readers. JAWS is the industry standard and the most used. It's also the most expensive, and it's only available on Windows machines. There's also NVDA, so NV is in Victor, D is in dog, A. That one is freely available and only on Windows. And then VoiceOver on Mac and iOS. That comes pre-installed. If you have an iPhone or you have a Mac, you already have VoiceOver and could test with it. And ChromeVox, which is an add-on for Chrome that reads you everything in the browser. There's also screen magnifiers, which, I'm sure some of you have done this before, just magnify the text in your browser or like change the settings on your phone. There is a full software called Zoom Text that people will use that has more intense capabilities, a high contrast keyboard. You saw the picture before. There was someone in the lab with the yellow keys with a large black font on them. That's a high contrast keyboard. And then a refreshable braille display, which sort of looks like a keyboard. There is like a silicone membrane and then some pins that push up to read the person in braille, so the person can read in braille. Actually, Tasha used to use one of those, especially, and preferred it for like long form academic articles. It was just easier for her to read the braille. So for hearing disabilities, transcripts, captioning, people may use hearing aids. To be compliant with standards, you want to include either transcripts or captioning. Including both is best. It's also great for learning in general, but at least one of those needs to be present for it to be considered accessible. And then for cognitive disabilities, there are browser extensions for reading that will like strip out all the ads and just really focus you in on the main text. And then color overlays, like an actual physical color overlay, can help people with dyslexia read more quickly. And then for mobility, alternative input devices, so things like a head wand or a mouth wand so people can actually push the keys. And then eye tracking control is becoming more popular as that software is getting more sophisticated. So actually using your eyes to move the mouse around. I also wanted to bring up Harvard's new digital accessibility policy. So I will say I am not the expert on this policy, and there is still lots of documentation being developed about it. But I did want to mention that it was adopted in April of this year, and basically says that any new digital content created and produced at Harvard after December 1st, 2019 must adhere to the WCAG 2.1 standard. So this is a universally accepted standard that's managed by the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, that has a list of guidelines of how content must be made accessible. And this would also apply to code for redesigned websites as well. So as I mentioned before, policies and standards can be really helpful, especially when learning about this subject area. But what's most important is to keep your focus people focused as much as possible. So I just want to share a final quote from another Harvard student, and she is dyslexic. So she's Nikita Anderson, and a graduate student, and she's the co-founder of the journal Disability Disclosed. And she leads efforts across Harvard with a group of students to make disability support more streamlined. And she wrote that disability is incredibly diverse. I'm not sure how to accurately explain the many different disability issues experienced by students from different schools at Harvard. So as Carrie and Gabe discussed tools and practices to make peer learning more accessible, I'd ask you to just keep this point in mind as a reminder of the differences that we can both see and we are unseen that may exist with class participants. All right.
Thanks, Amy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about accessible peer learning, and I really like this definition of it, which says that it's shifting the focus from addressing the needs of a single student to creating a learning environment that works for all learners. I think this is really important because, like Amy mentioned, some of these disabilities are unseen. And so if you can create an environment from the start that is accessible and that is welcoming, I think that that's going to that's going to go a really long way with your students. But before I get into my spiel, I just want to introduce myself. I am Carrie Foley. I'm the manager of course design at Harvard Extension School. And I'm also a teacher at Harvard Extension School. So I teach an online course called Designing Educational Media. So obviously accessibility is very important in that topic. In preparing for this talk, I learned so much from Gabe and from Amy, all these little things that actually as a teacher I wasn't doing. And some of them are actually really easy to implement. So there's low-hanging fruit things that as someone that does not have a disability, I didn't even think of. And so I thought I'd share some of these practices, these general practices with you. Looking around the room, I know many of you, so I know we have some teachers here, we have some course designers, hopefully we have some students as well. And so while I'll focus mostly on teaching methodology and practice, a lot of the stuff you can do as learners and as peers in general, so hopefully it is general enough. So just to begin with some general practices, the first one I think is really important is to make space for students to disclose, right? So make it safe and easy for them. And so one thing that I like to do, regardless of whether or not I'm talking about accessibility, is just to share my goals on the first day on teaching. And accessibility is one of those goals. And so I think this is really important, especially as it relates to peer learning, because if your students don't feel comfortable letting you know that maybe you're making a mistake or that perhaps there's something that you could do a little bit different that would make the environment more accessible, that's a great thing to be able to ask them to do and to make a space for that. Whereas, you know, we're at Harvard, hierarchy is very known around here. It sometimes can be difficult to talk to your faculty member about things that maybe they could do differently. So creating a space for them to do that is really important. The other thing that's really important is to give them a space to disclose what they actually need. And this isn't always an easy thing for folks to do, especially with those hidden disabilities. And so one option for this could be to use a Canvas survey. There's a great tool in Canvas that lets you make it anonymous if you want to. And you can actually just ask, even if it's just one question that says, is there anything that I should keep in mind in terms of accessibility, such as, give some examples, and they can then disclose that. And you can keep that in mind while you're teaching throughout the course of the semester. It's also a really great way to create connection with your students and to let them know that you care, which at Extension School we care a lot about, so I hope you guys do. And then the second one is to be mindful of the space you're in. So I'm not sure if anyone has taken a look around here, but this is not necessarily the most accessible classroom for if you wanted to be doing activities that involved a lot of mobility. And one of the great things about Harvard is our history, but we also have a lot of old buildings. And so this is a newer building, and it's still not necessarily as physically accessible as it could be. And so keep that in mind as you are creating and designing activities for your students. Another thing that didn't seem very obvious to me in the beginning, and now I'm like, how did I not think of this, is to arrange a quiet space for any students that might need it. And this is for a few different reasons. Obviously, someone that's hearing impaired, if you're in a classroom and this class is full and you say turn to your neighbor and have a chit chat, you have, 80 conversations going on? And so somebody that has a hearing impairment may have a difficult time communicating with their partner. But then somebody with a cognitive impairment, such as a difficulty with attention, as somebody that has that impairment, I hear every conversation going around in the room. And so it's really hard for me to connect directly with another student if there's a lot going on. And so having a place where folks can go and to do that without having to ask for it is really, really valuable.
Just to jump in there, it can just be the hallway. Like if you or just have something in the back of your head ready. It doesn't mean you have to reserve 2 rooms, but just think about that a little bit.
Yes, for sure. Thank you for jumping in on it. The other thing that I didn't realize I wasn't quite doing as a teacher was using 2 forms of communication when you're in front of the class. So for example, anything you write on the board, you'll notice that earlier today when Gabe was pointing you all toward the Hilt resources, he read the URL out loud. And so even just going that extra step of making sure that whatever you're writing, you're also saying. So as a high school student, I wore glasses. I currently wear corrective lenses. And I don't know why. I think maybe it's because I was in high school. I refused to wear my glasses, and I have terrible vision. So I would never tell anyone, and I would sit at the back of the room, and I would just squint instead of just wearing my corrective lenses. And so of all people, I should have thought of this as something that's really valuable. But so try to keep it in mind. Also, as you're showing images, or if you're screen sharing, if you're in an online course, narrating or explaining the images that you're showing, if they're not decorative, is a really valuable thing that you can do. And then if you're teaching online, using your webcam is actually incredibly valuable because students can then read your lips, unless you talk as fast as me, in which case get captioning. But also it's really great for community and connection as well. So we at Extension School love the turning on your camera, but from an accessibility standpoint, it's really valuable as well. And then last general practice is to make your physical materials accessible. So again, we created a bit.ly link with all of our resources. All of those documents are accessible. We checked them, and Gabe will show you how to do that later. But creating an accessible digital version of your handouts gives students that need either extra time reading through them, or maybe they need to use an assistive technology. That makes that easier for them without them having to ask. And then try to utilize large text and high contrast images on your handouts. So as you'll see, we used as much space as we could. So the general rule of thumb is if you have the space, use it. Large scale text is essentially at this point considered for WCAG, or what is it? How do you pronounce it? WCAG? WCAG, okay. Is a large text is like between 14 and 18 point font, but there are lots of little differences depending on the type of font that you're using. So if you're curious, in the slide notes, I actually created a link just directly to that in the standards, just so that you can make sure that the text you're using is large enough. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gabe to talk about tools.
Just to finish introducing myself, I'm Gabe. I also work, like Harry, at the Extension School. I'm on 2 different teams. I'm on the teaching and learning team, where I get to think about needs in the classroom and new pedagogical practices. And then I am also on the development team, where I get to build tools. So I'm going to hopefully be able to take this from 2 different perspectives. One from using tools and one from building tools. And so I'd like to kind of dive into just a general overview of tools and accessibility. And the first question I wanted to answer is, why are tools in this mix? And Amy did a great job of going over assistive technology. I think that's the first thing to start with, is that assistive technology, just in general, works a lot better with electronic content rather than paper. So just being able to include assistive technology in that picture, tools, and electronic content work a lot better. And then also, for those of us working in online classes or having students collaborate over the internet in some way, tools end up being part of the picture no matter what. So I wanted to start by breaking up the general tips into 3 different categories. So here are 3 different ways to make your tools accessible. The first one is to just choose accessible tools. Second is to build accessible tools if you're one of those people that is working on tools. And then finally, to adopt accessible practices while you're using tools. So to start with the first one, choosing accessible tools. This can be a tough thing to do. I wish that I could point you to a list of all of the tools and how accessible they are, but I can't. The best I can give you is that, in general, Harvard licensed tools are ones that have gone through more of a process. We've worked with the third party while making an agreement, and so there's a higher chance that those are going to be more accessible. So the best way to get that list is to talk with your instructional technology team or your IT group. And then secondly, we use Canvas across the university, and Canvas is substantially conformant with WCAG 2.1 standards, level A and AA. And what that just means is that those features in Canvas are going to generally be really good bets for accessible tools. So if there is a tool in Canvas and that works for your class, definitely go with that one. If you're someone who builds tools, or if you're someone who builds content, this is something to think about. There's a lot of different pieces when you're building tools, buttons and links and menus and all those kinds of things. And there really isn't any reason to reinvent the wheel. There are great toolkits out there. So the first tip I would have is to use UI toolkits. There are a couple that I've listed here. The first one is Instructure UI. This is the one that Canvas is based off of. And so it follows the same standards that Canvas does, as long as you use them properly. And the second one that's pretty popular is Bootstrap. But in general, if you just use these UI elements, then you'll be off to a great start. The second thing is just common sense. Use conventions. So if you have a submit button, call it submit. Don't call it go or something else that's not usual. Those words help people to identify the things that they're going to interact with. So name things the way that they're usually named, put them in the usual places. So nav is usually at the top, footer information at the bottom, stuff like that. Just kind of common sense things. And then to use headers properly. So bold is not the same as a header. To use those actual header tags, and then to use tab indexing for people navigating with the keyboard or people using screen readers. And then finally, resist the temptation to add what we call glitter to your page, your content, or your tool. So what that means is things shouldn't flash more than 3 times a second. And in general, if you can just avoid flashing items, then that's great as well. And fewer animations, and then also if you have media content, allow the user to control it. So allow them to mute it, allow them to stop a video, or pause or play a video. And in general, this just reduces cognitive overload. Yeah. Yeah.
I noticed in a lot of the online courses that are being built, folks are using animation with an overlay of the professor talking, or the animations over the professor talking as a way for your visual learner to better understand the concepts. Does this apply to those types of animations that are being built?
Yeah, it does.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
So I know at HarvardX, they've actually worked with faculty members in that exact kind of scenario to make sure the narration that the faculty member or the instructor is providing takes into account what is visually being shown, just as you were describing before, for making sure that, you know, if there's a diagram or a pie chart or a cell being shown, that the instructor is explaining that and not just saying, like, if you look in the upper right, which that's not going to be helpful, but actually just building that into the lecture narrations.
Okay, so then in that instance, it would be okay to use animations because they're describing it.
Right.
Yeah. And I think what I'm talking about are those animations that are literally following on what the professor is saying. It's just providing someone who's more visual learner to understand the concepts.
Yeah. I think that's okay as long as there is a way to pause it, stop it.
Okay.
Yeah.
This does really come back to having 2 forms of communication. So if you're doubling that with something else, then that can really help. One of the easier things to kind of think about with the no glitter is, like, if you're building a web application and there's really no reason for sparkles to fly out of the submit button, then just maybe not. But definitely those kind of more complex situations are things to think about as well. But there are a lot of low-hanging fruit. And then finally, once you're using a tool, or once you've built a tool and you're using it, adopt accessible practices. So just because a tool follows a standard doesn't mean that you're using it in a way that is most effective. So here are 3 things that you can do to use a tool in a most effective way for accessibility. First off, if you're writing content or you're adding media, make sure that you use simple, plain language. Break up content in an intuitive way so that it's digestible. So things like bullets and headers are really important when you're creating content. Second thing is to be descriptive. So if you are adding links or buttons and things like that, instead of click here, which doesn't really tell us what will happen when you click there, add a link title, for example, download syllabus. And also add some alternate text for media, and do that. We definitely encourage to add alternate text to add value. One place where you don't want to do that is for decorative images. For example, we did not add alternate text for the icons on these slides because they're decorative, and that adds, again, it adds to cognitive overload. Just another thing that they're going to have to listen to while going through the slides that doesn't really add any value because we have the language underneath. And then finally, use high contrast media, text, colors, all those kinds of things. So WCAG 2 level AA, which is what we're all aspiring to follow, it requires a high contrast ratio. And it depends on a lot of different factors, the font size and stuff like that. But one good thing that you can start with is you can Google a tool like colorsafe.co, which you can put your colors in and it'll tell you if they meet the standards. And if they don't, they'll suggest new colors that you can use. And this just helps people to see and digest that material. All the stuff that we're talking about is on the handout in front of you. Our goal is for these tools and practices and tips to be little bite-sized things that you can take into your classrooms, into your programs, into your learning environment. And so each of these little bite-sized pieces is on the handout, so I won't go over these. So without further ado, we'd like to dive into peer learning activities, and Carrie will take it from here.
Thank you, Gabe. So when Gabe and I were brainstorming activities to use as examples, we decided to go with first of all, the activity that always happens, right? Turn to your neighbor, think, pair, share. Everyone has done this at some point in their life, and if they haven't, come talk to me because I want to learn from you. And the other one we thought about was these long-term group projects. And for me, as someone that designs a lot of online group projects, this is something that comes up all the time, just from like how the heck do I make this work in general? And so a lot of these practices will kind of double as like, also, this is a good thing you can do if you're going to do a long-term online group project. So they're basically, if you look at an axis, it's 2 people for a really short period of time, and then the other example is potentially lots of people for a really long time. So hopefully you'll get some ideas from these. There's so many activities, so hopefully these will just at least get your feet wet a little bit. So the first one, like I said, turn to your neighbor or think, pair, share. A couple of just general practices for the think portion. First of all, sharing an accessible digital version. I know we've talked about this, but the point I want to make here is that if you can share it before class, that goes an extra step, because number one, if you're using assistive technology and you need to download that digital one, I mean, how many people here were not listening when we were trying to download it, right? It's like adding extra cognitive load. But also for anyone that has a cognitive impairment, it gives them an opportunity to read the prompt, get ready for it, think through anything they need to, prepare any materials that they may need to bring to class to do the activity. It's easier said than done. Sometimes you do want to give it the moment of because you don't want students to prepare for some other reason, but just use your best judgment, try your best. And also don't underestimate the importance of the think step in here. A lot of people that I've noticed, they tend to give, okay, take a few minutes and think and write some stuff down. And then we'll go into the pair version and we'll spend time pairing, which is wonderful. But if you can give a little bit more time for that think step, it's really valuable for those students that might need the extra time and don't want to ask for it. My general rule of thumb is I try to figure out how much time I would need, and then I double or triple it. And if they finish a little bit early and they're waiting around, that's okay. They're probably checking their Facebook anyway, so give them some more time. But also try to encourage your students to write down their thoughts. Some people need to do this in order to be part of this activity. And so normalizing that in some way is really helpful. But also there's so much research that suggests that just writing things down in your own handwriting helps solidify and helps with recall anyway. So just making that a general practice could be a really good thing in this scenario. The next thing is obviously the pair step. And so we mentioned a couple of these things earlier, so I'm going to go through them quickly. Arranging a quiet space for students that need to, so leaving the room, or maybe there's a room nearby that's empty. And then of course encouraging students that are in the web conference to use their webcam so that there can be lip reading. But the other thing is that if you are doing an analog activity, something that includes something that's not digital, so paper, if you know that you have a student in the room that has a disability that has disclosed it, do your best to pair them with a student that not only does not have that same disability, but that's prepared to help them. So this goes back to that beginning survey where you find out what your students' needs. If somebody directly discloses and you know who that person is, it's totally okay to go to them and say, okay, when we're doing activities, what would make it easier for you when you're being paired with a student? And maybe that means pairing them with somebody that they know and that they trust and that they're okay sharing with. So try to do that if possible. And then lastly, during the share activity, remember that describing those images and narrating what's on the screen is really important. But the point I want to make here is that in order for your class to really be accessible, everyone has to participate. So this is just a general rule of practice for teaching, but also for peers. So really try to encourage that so that you're creating the environment that you set out to at the beginning of the semester when you shared your goals. So now I'm going to turn it over to Gabe to tell you how to do all the things that I just said.
So there's a lot of tools out there that I can point to. I'm going to just start with a few really basic things that would seem intuitive, but a lot of people don't always remember to take advantage of. The first thing is if you're one of those people who is creating the electronic version of your content in Microsoft Word, then it's great to start in outline mode. This forces you to create those headers, organize your content, create the sections, and then you can go into print view. Either way, if you just are making sure that you're dividing your content up, adding those headers, that's a really great way for people to be able to jump to the part of the content that they're looking for. For example, if you're making a syllabus and you are using headers, then students can jump maybe to the reading list if that's something that they wanted to go through, instead of having to read through the whole thing to find the reading list. And then again, if you're using Microsoft Word, there's this really amazing button in Microsoft Word. It's built in. It's the Check Accessibility button, and it goes through your content for you. It walks you through step by step on how to make your content more accessible. We have a bit.ly here for you to check out. It's bit.ly/ms-a11y-checker. And that is a link to how you can find that Check Accessibility button for yourself. It depends on your operating system and the version of Microsoft Word that you're using. They put it in all different places. But as long as you know where that button is, you're definitely well on your way. And it'll just walk you through the process. And then once you're done checking your accessibility and you finish the content, a lot of people like to put it in a PDF form. And our tip there is don't save it as a PDF. Save it as a PDF. Save it as a PDF, don't print it to PDF. We have a link for that as well, bit.ly/ms-a11y-export. And I have a screenshot here. In the screenshot, we're exporting as a PDF, and there's two checkboxes. One of them says best for electronic distribution and accessibility. One says best for printing. Check the one that says best for electronic distribution and accessibility. It's really easy to print to PDF. The unfortunate thing there is it strips out a lot of the stuff that makes it accessible. So save as PDF, don't print. Yes?
So are you aware of anything even remotely similar to this in the LaTeX environment?
Ooh, I haven't looked into that yet.
Yeah, LaTeX is like an alternative, free way to type documents.
Yeah, I think that, so I'm not sure exactly about LaTeX. If you export that to a PDF, then you can use other software like Adobe Acrobat to go through that PDF and then modify it where it needs to. So if it doesn't come from Microsoft Word, that's an option for PDFs in general. Anything that I'm missing here? No. It's a tough world. Yeah, and definitely I think that maybe that's a first step. I'd have to go look into it more though.
The other thing I'd add is if you can add headings, like actually just to mark things as headings, that's the most important thing here. Yeah, so if you can do that, then that would get you most of the way there.
Yeah. Great. If you're one of those classes that is doing an activity online, one example is through Zoom, which is a video conferencing platform. But of course, there's a lot of other things out there to do the same thing. We're really driving this one home. Make sure that not only you, but your students turn on cameras. Again, this is for lip reading and other reasons, but it's really important to ask the students to take that moment at the beginning of the activity, at the beginning of the class, to ask them to turn on their cameras. It's really easy to forget the step, but really easy to remember it and have people turn on their cameras. Second is, a lot of people don't know, but it's possible to assign a closed captioner, a live closed captioner in the classroom. So that can be a TA, that could be an instructor, that could be a student in a group. And you just assign them to be the closed captioner, and they can closed caption as it's going. We have a bit.ly for that as well, bit.ly/zoom-cc, and that will walk you through at least the Zoom closed captioning setup instructions. There's a lot of stuff that I have missed, and there's a lot of other tools to use. One of the ones that I wanted to mention is a project that I get to work on, which is one that we previously called Swipe In. We're kind of rebranding it as something called I'm Here. And it's for those in the classroom activities. For example, we're talking about turn to your neighbor right now. In that example, people would swipe into the classroom using this tool. It'll randomly divvy them up into little groups. And then they can use those groups for the Turn to Your Neighbor exercise, for flipped classroom groups, for lab pair programming assignments, all different kinds of things. The important thing that we can do with this tool is we can also take into account those accessible constraints. So in this classroom, there is the back row that people, perhaps in a wheelchair, might be able to access but not be able to come down here. So if there was a group that was assigned to the front of the room, then we couldn't randomly divvy them up into that group. So just to keep that in mind, if you're doing something maybe through a tool like this, or some other automatic random process, it's important to build that extra step to allow for those extra constraints. And then also, a tool like this also makes it possible for people to attend without handwriting, so without having to pass around a sheet and write their name. Again, everything's on the handout. And we have one more example I think we'll dive into, and I'll hand it back to Carrie.
Sorry, I just have one
Yeah.
question about alt text in Word or PDF. So we're producing case studies that we publish, and we have a lot of exhibits, and some of these exhibits are very data oriented. So maybe you're showing like multi-year trends in a chart. So when you're adding the alt text for our case writers, would they simply say chart explaining multi-year trends, or do they have to go into specific detail of the data that's within those charts?
I think
So the recommendation is to, in the alt text, explain like the outcome of the chart, like the main thing that you would learn from looking at this chart. Like the trend over the last 10 years has been a decline in the number of people taking taxis or something like that. But then always offer a text alternative that just has the data that has built the chart. So that way, if the person really wants to dig in to see each year, it's easier for them to go to the text alternative. Sometimes that's just, a link to an Excel document or a Google Sheet or another web page that exists that has the information written out in a table view.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful.
Sure.
All right, so now we're going to dive into long-term or semester-long group projects, and they don't have to be semester-long, just multiple weeks. And so some of the things that are really great about these is that they do foster collaboration, and then for teachers, they make it a lot easier for you to grade if they're sharing a deliverable, so you get to grade a lot less. And so they have lots of perks, but they're also really challenging to do on campus, and they're even more challenging to do online. And so, like I said earlier, some of these things kind of just double as things you can do for your to make your group projects go a little bit smoother. And so the first one is to facilitate your group formation online, even if it's an on-campus course. I know every one of the DCE on-campus courses does have a Canvas site, so hopefully that's the same at other schools. But you could do a couple different things. You could create a thread on your discussion board to allow students to communicate. I've done this a few times. It's not always super successful because a lot of our students are shy. But another thing you can actually do is use the groups feature of Canvas and allow for self-sign-up. And one thing that we've been really successful with is actually labeling the groups either by time. So I'm going to meet Mondays at 5 p.m. And students can sign up for that group. And that way they don't have to have that obnoxious email chain of, well, I can't make that one. What about this one? It's done for them. And that's helped a lot. But then the other thing you can do is actually have them by interest. So, if you're teaching a law course that has, specialties, you could say that I'm really interested in, commercial law. I want to do a project on that. Or, I'm interested in divorce law. I don't know anything about law. But, so you can do it that way. And so students can say, okay, I would like to meet with people that have similar interests as me. And so, like we said, Canvas is accessible. So that is an accessible tool that you can use to facilitate that group formation. The other really important thing I always tell people is to begin the project with a project charter. And this should be like their first deliverable, their very first expectation. And what you can ask them to do in this assignment is to be explicit about what communication tools they want to use for collaboration. This is really important because not everyone has access to the same tools. It could be an accessibility reason. It could also be that they can't afford to buy an app at this moment, or maybe they're students in China, and China blocks Google. So if you're using Google Docs, which is actually a very accessible tool, some of our students can't actually use it. This may not be applicable for on-campus students, but we experience this a lot at DCE. And then the other thing you want to do is ask your students to determine norms for their face-to-face meetings, and this could mean in person or online. And this is just things like are we all going to use our webcams? Are we going to all don't forget to use 2 forms of communication. I really need a Zoom captioner. And what's really great about this is that not only does it set the expectations from the start, but it gives the students that need to ask for that accommodation an opportunity to do it without having to say, hey, actually, before we get started, I have these needs that I need to have been met, right? So again, it's just about providing that safe opportunity for the students. And then also provide accessible assignment details. So of course that really means reducing confusion with your assignment prompts by being really detailed and clear. I love rubrics, so if you can use them, please do. Canvas has a great rubrics tool. If you need help thinking through your rubrics, email me, I love them. And then also share an accessible digital version of the assignment prompt, right? So to show you how to do all of this,
So I'm going to keep this relatively quick. I'm hoping we'll have time for...
I don't think you're going to have time for the activity.
So there's a lot of different pieces to a semester-long or some longer group project. And so hopefully I'm going to touch on a few tools that help that process. So the first thing is to encourage accessible collaboration. So a lot of the group project will be collaborative between the group members. The first thing I suggest is to create a space online for collaboration. So use those collaborative online spaces and then help set the norm for students. So if you're using something like g.harvard, encourage students to use those headers and outlines in those planning documents and whatever they're using to collaborate. And then also, again, coming back to the group charter, let groups choose their communication tools. So in addition to giving them the space to talk about their, in that group charter to talk about the standard for and the tools for communication, also give them the choice. If you want to start with something, Canvas groups are great, but of course there's lots of other different tools out there that students can look at, such as Slack or Zoom. But the important thing is that the students have some agency in there so they can speak up if it doesn't work for them. Another thing for these semester-long group projects is that at the end or sometimes throughout, there's shared deliverables. And the important thing there is that students should be able to collaborate, review each other's work, comment on each other's work, and that's always so much easier if there is a digital copy. So we suggest that you always have some sort of digital submission. Even if it's a traditionally not digital assignment, try to think of ways that you could allow a digital copy of that assignment or of that submission. And one of the easiest ways to have people submit that is just to set up submissions online in Canvas, which is really easy. Your academic technology group or IT probably has some tools to help you with that. And then if you are doing a group assignment where the deliverable is a media type of deliverable, like they have to create a video or some sort of presentation, definitely consider media alternatives. So auto captioning isn't always very reliable, so it's great if you have these types of media submissions, especially if they're shared with peers, to give students the extra task of writing a transcript or a written description of what's happening during their video. And this is also really a great thing to add as step 0 in the assignment because it's just a great planning step. If you're going to write out your transcript or you're going to write out your outline, that's a great step in planning the media and then sharing it with the class